Hello there, I'm Jonathan Rowson. I'm Director of Perspectiva, and I'm wearing this yellow and blue, slightly ridiculous outfit in solidarity with Ukraine. It takes a great deal more than a few items of clothing to do that, of course, and we all have to figure out how we can help the most. In my role as Director of Perspectiva, I would like to start an event series about Ukraine, because I think it's really, more than many realize, the defining battle of our time. And I want to use this first session just as a kind of stream of consciousness monologue to make sense of why. But I already have a few speakers lined up over the next few days and weeks. And I don't know where it will end exactly, but I feel moved to begin to explore this because, you know, there are two scenarios now. I mean, there's always more than two, but there's to get the pattern, there's two main scenarios. One is really the end of the world. One is cataclysmic Armageddon. One thing leads to another, escalation leading to an armed conflict that spreads and intensifies, wiping out much of life on, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, and who knows, maybe beyond. Obviously, that's not very likely, and it's not currently in the most probable set of events, but it did become a little bit more likely recently. There is a kind of logic baked in here that means that that prospect that I grew up with. I'm 44, and I you know, lived through some of the Cold War as a child. And it, you know, it's a real possibility again. Nuclear war is not, you know, very likely, but it's a possibility. And that's, you know, that's the first reason this is a sort of existential struggle. So the first reason it's a defining battle. It's an existential struggle that could become a matter of life or death for many millions of people, not just those currently in trouble in Ukraine. The second reason is that kind of ideological. The pattern unfolding here is something like what we currently see in the USA. We see it in the relationship to some extent between Taiwan and China. We see it within many countries. We've seen, which is basically the battle between authoritarianism and democracy, or another way of putting that is between open and closed societies. And that's one of the ways of understanding what's happening here. It's a sort of front line of that broader battle. And it's not something to be dismissed lightly, because for various reasons. One is that democracy has been declining in the world through various metrics of that democratic health for several years now. You have authoritarian leadership in China, in Russia, in India, arguably, and many other countries throughout the world, Turkey, the Philippines. And, you know, it's not that far off happening in some European countries as well. And some might even say it's happened to the UK. So it's a real problem. And democracy is in trouble, you know, and so when Ukraine is attacked, that's part of what's going on. It's part of that larger geopolitical struggle between open and closed societies. And the reason I use that language, I don't want to think that open and closed is the only sort of master category of how a society can be. But it's somewhat relevant in the context of people following Perspectiva when we speak about the meta crisis, by which we mean the kind of underlying drivers of all of the various different problems in the world, ecological, political, economic, and so forth. That when we think of it in terms of the meta crisis, some see the way the world is going vis-a-vis technological developments, the power of AI, sort of data extractive technologies, you know, devices that are addictive by design. Increasingly, the public realm is controlled by private actors. There doesn't see the state is becoming stronger in some places where it's oppressive, but weaker in other places where it's meant to be more democratic. Why does that matter? Because many predict three possible futures, right? One is roughly collapse, chaos, you know, precipitated by ecological collapse, problems with food supply, water supply, wet bulb temperatures, violent weather, and so forth. All of the justified scare stories, many of which are already unfolding vis-a-vis ecological collapse, alongside a kind of infodemic, a kind of breakdown in their capacity to make sense. And then the other problems going on with mental health and people feeling disconnected and alienated from their governments. And so the possibility of everything just falling apart bit by bit, step by step, is a real one. You could say it's an attractor. It's the default scenario for the world system as a whole. Many believe is not that good. It's like you need some countervailing motion, right? Now, part of the challenge is that one of the countervailing motions is the authoritarian one. And there's a lot of creeping, some would say that climate change is a sort of fascist dream at some level, because although many of them deny it initially, it can serve as a justification for all sorts of authoritarian control. Those who have watched The Handmaid's Tale will know that in amongst all the horror and the misogyny and the brutality, there was this story that it had to be done to save the planet that was otherwise, ecologically in peril. Now, that's worth just keeping in mind, because one of the major attractors of the time, as I say, is collapse, but the other is authoritarianism, that there is a sort of default move towards authoritarian governments already underway. And within that, the third attractor, if you like, is some kind of viable open society. By the way, I borrow this analysis partly from Tristan Harris and Daniel Schmachtenberger, but it's more widely known as well. And that middle position of like, how do we have a viable open society? That's what Ukraine was speaking to. In the context of the meta crisis, Ukraine was there saying, look, this stuff, the good state, the free press, the functional market, the possibility to create your own businesses and shape your society, to learn, to use your own language, to create culture, nation building. They were all for it. They said, you guys taking it for granted. You've forgotten how wonderful this stuff is. And it was going, I'm sure that, we'll bring people on who can speak more directly to Ukrainian recent political history. But it was going well enough, some would say, to scare the large authoritarian neighbor that this was too much of a good example for the attractor of the open society, and that it might undermine the sort of kleptocratic, quasi-mafia-like control that exists in much of Russian society. Now, that's worth keeping in mind vis-a-vis the other outcome here, while most of the outcomes seem quite bleak, if I'm honest. There have been moments in recent days where there are glimpses of hope too, that you see large numbers of Russians protesting, saying this is too much, we cannot accept this in silence, knowing that they face possible prison time, knowing that it's very risky for them. Nonetheless, many thousands are kind of growing movement inside Russia, who are not czarist by nature. There is another Russia, at least one, that could come to pass. So you could be looking at, the very best case scenario is an end to Putin, end to the war, an end to Putin's regime, a reconciliation of some kind, which will take many years, and a different kind of Russia. Now, is that likely? No, it's not that likely. Just as nuclear war is not that likely. But they're both there as sort of, to keep in mind. It's not clear how this will play out yet. Right, so the first issue, like I say, existential. That's why it's the defining battle of our time. It could lead to nuclear war. Not likely, but possible. The second is ideological, which is a battle between two main patterns of society that are both in their own way trying to respond to incipient collapse, which is happening in the world system as a whole. Open and closed societies, broadly conceived, democracy via authoritarianism. Now, Ukraine is at the front of both of those things, but I think there's a third reason that's deeper, and mostly what I want to focus on. Before I do that, let me say briefly what Ukraine means to me. I don't want to overplay it. It's not, before recent developments, it's not as though I thought about it every day or was in regular contact with people from Ukraine, but it means something to me. It's not just another place. Going back quite some time to 1989, my first international chess tournament abroad when I represented Scotland was in Mamaia, Romania. And my first round opponent was Vasily Yemelin from the Soviet Union. And I distinctly remember, a very vivid memory, of sitting there at the board with my saltire Scottish flag up against the hammer and sickle representing the Soviet Union, which was, of course, the other dominant world power in the Cold War context. And it felt extraordinary to be playing someone from the Soviet Union. But at the time, there was only the Soviet Union. The idea of Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Belarusia, and so forth, wasn't kind of there. There was just the Soviet Union, and those who knew it well were aware of these different nationalities and ethnicities and everything else. But for me as a young child, there was the Soviet Union, and I was up against it. So when 2 years later the Soviet Union broke up, I think I played a few more people from the Soviet Union, one of whom was Ukrainian, Sergei Ovsievich, who's still a grandmaster, and I believe he's from Ukraine. And I played him again very young, when I was like 14 or something. So a good 30 years ago. I mentioned that because a couple of years subsequent to that, I forget the exact date, but when the Soviet Union broke up and there was a Yeltsin coup in Moscow, and suddenly a sort of agreement that many of these countries would secede from the Soviet Union, I was at the Lloyds Bank Masters in London. And I have a vivid memory of a player who won't be known to the non-chess players here, but Alexei Shirov, who at that point he went on to represent Latvia for at least for a time, before I think he moved to Spain and things changed. But at that time, I remember him watching, trying to watch news events unfold while also playing this tournament. But there were many other players from what was becoming the former Soviet Union in real time. So it's sort of vivid for me, this clash between Ukraine and Russia, bringing up the old history of we were once together, we're now apart. I feel it at some level. And the reason I feel it a bit more intensely is that in subsequent years, I played many people from Ukraine. Very often, they're a major chess power. I think I was, if I remember rightly, I've been at an Olympiad where they won the Olympiad. And so, I know some of them personally. And finally, I was in Kyiv. I'm still struggling with how to say that because my mind wants to say Kiev, but I know it's Kyiv, spelt with a Y, and yet somehow the sound doesn't quite come out right. So forgive me for that. But I was there in 2019 because the Emerge Gathering was on. And the Emerge Gathering was an event that Perspectiva had some responsibility for. And it was a gathering of, I forget the exact number, but circa 150 or so people. And many of them were from Ukraine, many of them were local, and they were full of the spirit of becoming it, the work of nation building was very strongly felt. And they were excited, full of ideas, speaking, they were interested particularly in bildung, which is, some of you who know Perspectiva's work well will know is a kind of form of transformative civic, moral and aesthetic education, which has been modeled particularly in the Nordic countries, but it's originally a Germanic idea. And basically bildung is a view of education where the inner and outer transformation are coextensive. They happen together in the same way. And I was really touched when I was sitting in one of the breakout groups. And I think it was actually a breakout group, if I remember rightly, where that Rebel Wisdom were hosting, if I haven't got it wrong. And the guy next to me said, who are you? And I said, I'm Jonathan Rowson. He goes, oh, I'm currently translating your bildung essay into Ukrainian. Because I'd written an essay for the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity about why I felt bildung was the key idea to help us deal broadly with ecological breakdown. That I felt that ultimately this is an educational challenge of understanding, perception, capability, and various other things. And that I tried to make sense of the connection. For many people, that's strange. Like they think only in terms of dealing with climate change through technocratic means of energy and tax rates and different uses of land and so forth. but there is a deeper curriculum there about what kind of human being we are, what kind of economic system we have. And education has a huge role there, but not just education in general, particularly this kind of transformative education that opens the question about what human beings are, what society is for, what the proper relationship between the individual and the collective is. And the Ukrainian sort of cohort there really took to this idea. It's by no means mine, by the way. I'm just saying I wrote an essay about it, but there's a much broader field of work about it. So yeah, when Mihail is his name, he said to me, I'm translating your essay into Ukrainian. I can't tell you how touched I was. Like, I've had, my chess books have been translated into other languages and stuff. And it's lovely when you get a query from a translator about a particular turn of phrase. But there was something about the fact that this essay was thought to be important enough to civil society in Ukraine that it was worthy of being translated into their language. So that was real. And then of course the time there was real, because you're now seeing Kyiv on the news. And I remember some of those sites and some particularly beautiful parts of the city. And one morning, ambling around with friends, we got to one of the major churches there. Was it St. Michael's Cathedral? I forget which name the one that we went into that morning was, but it was stunningly beautiful. And we came into a service that was underway just by luck. And there was incense and incantations and beautiful music and stunning, artifacts all around us. And it made an impression, and as did the people that I met there. So come forward to the present day, when I see this happening, I feel those first two things quite a bit. I feel there's a possible existential threat. I see there's definitely a kind of ideological battle. But there's something deeper going on that's more epochal. By epochal, I mean it's something about the spirit of the time that is not just a battle for ideology or governance, and not just a sort of real and present danger of averting nuclear war, but something more about, at this point in a time between worlds, and that expression needs a bit of unpacking, but there are many who believe that what we perceive as the meta-crisis, these converging threats, ecologically, politically, economically, and the sense of inward breakdown of not being able to make sense of mental health problems, and the sense of society or the world unraveling in a way that not everyone perceives, not everyone feels, but many do. Layman Pascal had a great, really great piece of writing and subsequent lecture at the Stoa where he spoke about being an Apocalypterian. And a lot of the people I'm describing are Apocalypterians. And that doesn't mean they're like, oh my God, the end of the world is nigh. Far from it. It's people who sort of perceive that, a bit like a chess player sees into a position and sees what's going to happen several moves in advance. It's sort of baked into the position that these converging threats are very serious. And we're looking at, technology well beyond our control, private actors who don't have the public interest at heart, breakdown of governance, loss of democratic legitimacy and authority, compounding ecological collapses, and meanwhile wars, and maybe more of them. So like for many people, but the thing is, to say that, the people that I'm referring to, the Apocalypterians, and I think I call myself one too, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're full of doom. It doesn't follow that you're, this is all, life's not worth living, let's give up, it's hopeless. Far from it. But there is something about paying attention to what is emerging negatively and threateningly, as if the world is sort of dying, while simultaneously attending closely to the world that's being reborn and recreated. And that's relevant to Ukraine now too, because there was an Emerge event with Valerie, whom you'll we'll have a proper event with Perspectiva with him soon. But he spoke of various things that are happening in Ukraine at the moment vis-a-vis this spirit I'm alluding to. And there's different ways of describing it, but one of the better ways, and the one that I would use, and this is also, I owe this partly to Lena Rachel Anderson and the conversation we had on this channel a little while ago. But there's something about the relationship to modernity in Russia, particularly in its current form of governance, and Ukraine, that they're quite different. So you could say that, and oversimplifying perhaps, but to make a point, that the Russian authoritarianism plus militarism plus imperialism in its own way is actually quite modern, and it's so much so that it's modernism on stilts, which is what they sometimes call hypermodernism. Hypermodernism is the kind of human servitude to technology, more or less. It's a sort of dystopian vision of the future in which all that was great and good about the world is somehow subverted by technological forces controlled by a small number of economic actors that use the technology to serve their interests while dehumanizing, devitalizing, and disenchanting the world as a whole. So that's one bleak vision of the future. Many of dystopias are a bit like that, where somehow humanity is squeezed out of us and we develop this horrible fixation with sort of instrumentally trying to get things through technology, but in a way that is sort of quasi-feudal, you know, it's sort of serving only a few people at the top. There's more to say about hypermodernism, but that's some of what you see in Russia going, why the hell would you have a war now? Like, people keep asking, what does he think he's doing? Like, what is this all about? And one way of understanding that is that it's kind of the modernist logic of progress. You know, modernity sort of literally means of the now, but it's also got this baked-in logic of orientation towards the future. That's what modernity gives us. It's a kind of future-oriented mentality. Now, the Russian, this is not Russian, Putin-esque view of the future seems to be something about an imperial Russia. Now, again, we'll come back to this, but you can find in the work of Gary Lachman and many sources, sort of philosophical sources of people in Russia who have a sort of spiritual view of what Russia is as a nation that sort of predates Bolshevik revolution and communism and Leninism and Stalinism and so forth. And so there's a sense of history becoming a bit circular, Putin becoming this kind of czar, but the underlying philosophy being this kind of great Russia theory that is quasi-mythical, even mystical in some ways. Now, but that's tied into this imperial expansionist project, which is the hypermodern part of it. Now, contrast that, you can, I'm sure I could better explain that, but contrast that with Ukraine, where you have, as far as I can interpret it, based on my time there and the people I know there, a kind of newfound delight in being a stable, viable democracy with certainly plenty of problems. I don't want to idealize or overly valorize the place, but a bright future. So again, through modernity, a relationship towards the future, but one that's, at least among the people that I spoke to, full of a kind of hope and self-becoming and creativity and so forth. Now, to call that metamodern needs a bit of qualification, and I'll leave an essay on metamodernism in the show notes. But what characterizes metamodernism is something, I think, about the human reflexivity towards modernity. So it's not so much progress as in, yes, we must keep churning along this path. Here's the grand plan, the deep vision. It's much more about, what does it mean to me? Like, what is, you know, it's much more about what is progress at the individual, cultural, smaller scale, and how do I orient life towards that? But more deeply, metamodernism, the meta in metamodernism is actually, it means many things, but it's principally metaxy, which has this view of a kind of oscillation between the progress of modernity on one hand, a kind of belief, a sincere belief that things can get better, that human beings are okay, that we're making progress, but also this equally important and sort of holding it in this oscillating tension, kind of postmodern perspective and deconstruction and irony that says, whose progress, for what end? Do you really know what you're doing? More playful, humorous, subversive, and there's a lot of that in Ukraine. The most recent funny meme I saw was asking people to donate to a rocket to send Putin to Jupiter. I mean, it was beautiful and hilariously funny, and yet in its own way quite serious semantic counterattack against the ideological warfare that is overly earnest coming from Russian propaganda vehicles. So the Ukrainian view is yes to a kind of progress, but with this discerning, ironic, quizzical, playful view towards it. Metamodern means many other things too. It's also got something about an emphasis on development and humans becoming better versions of themselves. And some would say it's got a sort of inherent indigeneity about it too, that sort of going back to the land, going back to the traditions. It's also not forsaking former patterns of life. So, it's not anti-religious, for example. It just tries to find a better relationship to that. So, because within the metamodern, and this is something that Lena Rachel Anderson puts quite well, there are all these different cultural codes baked into it, from the kind of indigenous to the pre-modern. So indigenous is kind of like, the land, the cycles of the seasons, the understanding of our relationship to forces of nature. Then there's something more like pre-modern's a bit more about the church and the kind of organization of society beginning to emerge. Modern is more about the kind of the market and the sort of patterns of commerce and relations there, and science and reason and so forth. Postmodern's a bit more sort of perspective, critique, knowing things from somewhere, not just knowing them from a generalized sense. And also quite a lot of irony and maybe humor, but not necessarily anything very substantive within it. But the metamodern view is something more about making the best of each of these codes, creating some kind of viable coalescence, so that the vision of society you have is one that is grounded in history and grounded in how human beings are, grounded in some of our best institutional developments, but it's sort of not beholden to them either. It remains free and creative and buoyant. And that's kind of what I'm sensing, or what is sensed at least in Ukraine. And to be honest, that's partly what we've sensed in the early phases of the war. Now, I hope it stays, well, I hope the war ends, of course, but that spirit, that apparently irrepressible spirit of the woman who said to the soldier, "What are you doing here? Put some seeds in your pockets so that at least when you die, you will create some flowers." The soldiers on Snake Island who told the Russian ship to, go fuck yourself, and even though they were vastly outnumbered, people admired that kind of courageous audacity. And there's other jokes like seeing Russian soldiers lost in rural Ukraine and people saying, "Do you know where you're going?" And the Russian soldiers saying no, and the Ukrainians saying, "Do you want me to tow you back to Russia?" And then other things so those are kind of a little bit humorous, but the other thing is Zelensky, the sort of main figurehead. Many have admired him. And to be honest, one of the things I thought about in recent events, now I don't know his past that well. I know he was on Strictly Come Dancing, or the equivalent in Ukraine. And I also know he did the voiceovers for Paddington Bear, the movie, I think, in Ukrainian, which I find just very touching. But there he is fighting for his life on the streets of Kyiv, trying to hold his nation's capital. He's has a family, 2 children. And to be honest, it seems a bit gushing, and I'm sure that there are political critiques of him. I don't know the politics well enough to be sure. So I say that because I've had experience in the past of, for example, being in the US and people lavishing praise on Margaret Thatcher because they get certain images of her, but not all of it. In the same way, while I deeply admire Zelensky and his response to the war, I don't know the prior history. I'm only saying that in the last 2 weeks, watching the way he's handled himself, I thought actually of one of these books that I was recommended some years ago when I was in therapy. And this is a book called, it's about archetypes as a mature masculine psyche. And it's called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. And I thought of Zelensky, and I thought, he's really got the full deck. There was a sort of clear warrior spirit, fighting for something bigger than himself, saying to people also, although I am the president of Ukraine, we're all presidents of Ukraine. Although I am a warrior, we're all warriors, and so forth. He also spoke about our weapons are our truth. Now, that's a risky line, right? That can be used by terrorists or dictators as well. But in the context of defending your home and your freedom, delicate, because it can easily be misused. But in this context, what I think he means is our truth is that there's something even more important than staying alive, which is fighting for a life worth living. And that's how I interpreted that line. And then, King, he is leading the country, and it sounds as though he's making the right decisions. He's also ambassadorially, if that's a word, being, representing his country at the highest world stage, speaking at the UN and the EU about Ukraine's plight, pleading for the right kind of help and discerning help as well. Magician, well, the magician is more about insight and seeing, inside the nature of things. But I sense that in some of the ways he communicates, that he has this deep sense of how to reach his people, a kind of emotional, symbolic, semiotic level. And Lover, you just see the kind of with his kind of fellow Ukrainians who also are taking up arms, and with his family, you see this quality of love too. So, although it's a bit gushing, and I'm sure it's not the full picture, the sort of the part of me that wants to be a good man sees that in Zelensky for what it's worth. And he's also a comedian, so the fact that he can wield humor is not a small thing either. But he's the sort of front of that thing. But what I'm trying to get at is that one of the reasons it's a battle of our time is that beyond the ideological battle I mentioned earlier, which is a function of how you run societies and what legitimate power looks like, and how much power the people as a collective have vis-a-vis the rulers or the elite that governs over them, there's also this kind of pattern of structure of feeling about what it means to be a human being and relate to the historical times we're in. And the structure of feeling coming out of Moscow and the tanks and the bombs is a kind of alienation from our human nature, I think. It's a subservience to the machine at some level, which is why it has this hyper-modern ethic and feeling ethos. Whereas the kind of playful but deadly serious, we will defend our home no matter what it takes, but you're not going to dehumanize us. You're not going to make us lose our spirit, feels much more metamodern. And, in that context, I forget who said it now, but I read somewhere on Twitter, as you do, about the way, if you are going to lose a war, the way you lose it matters a great deal. If an occupying force comes and you just fold and say, okay, you're bigger than us, you're stronger than us, we don't want any trouble, there's no point in us resisting and losing lives, we give up. We'll deal with whatever this is later, but for now, just don't kill anyone. Some would say that's wise. Some would say that you should do that. But the counter argument is, in doing that, you lose the country's mythos. You sort of lose that quality of being a people that is about collective endeavor to build a common life that's free and shared and valued. And that if you surrender that to an imperial external force, you might stay alive, but that power that was keeping you together will be lost. Now, I can't be sure that's exactly what's happening in Ukraine, but that's my sense of it, that they're doing a brilliant job at keeping the mythos of the country alive. And that's, it's not the only reason they're resisting. They're resisting because they feel it's the right thing to do. But in doing so, they're gaining the admiration of the world. They're getting increasingly recognized. Just got a fast track membership to the EU, for example. Meanwhile, Russia is arguably, there's a kind of incipient genocide going on. Some would say not necessarily wiping out all Ukrainians, but over time trying to sort of remove the idea of Ukraine as a distinct, separate, self-governing, self-creating country. And that's a little terrifying. That would mean, for example, Russian occupation followed by puppet regimes, followed by banning of the Ukrainian language, a kind of ideological program to annex with Russia entirely. You know, that's by no means out of the question. But in the meantime, what you have is Ukraine speaking to the world and saying, don't let this happen. You know, don't let us be eliminated. We are a real sovereign people. Now that matters for the world as a whole, because there's vitality there, there's renewal there, there's renaissance there, there's a spirit of looking to the future with confidence there that is enormously valuable and that risks being crushed. And that's one of many reasons why I think doing all we can to help Ukraine is really, really important. I know it's not just about Ukraine, by the way. I know that there's a similar story to be told in Palestine, for starters. And it's not like Ukraine, you know, sure they have no lack of skeletons in their closets, although I should add that they've had a really tortured history. I mean, not just, you know, throughout the years, there's many podcasts recently about Ukrainian history. One in particular on a podcast called The Rest is History that I can recommend, where you just really understand this country has been through so much. If anyone deserves a kind of break, it's Ukraine. Combination of what happened to them during Auschwitz. By the way, when we think of the Second World War, we think of Hitler invading Russia. Actually, it's not really Russia. Look at the map. Where did they go first? Ukraine, right? Lots of dead bodies as a result. Also, part of the process of the Holocaust was, you know, happening in Ukraine. A lot of Jewish Ukrainians. And then, of course, the problems of collectivization and the forced starvations in the Stalin era. And so now, when they're beginning to find their feet, when they're beginning to create a country of their own that looks potentially buoyant and generative and a sort of beacon of hope in some ways, they're beginning to be crushed. And it's not just sad, it's, you know, it's devastating. I mean, that's why it matters, I think, because it's not just that the geopolitical balance will be shifted, that Russia may have a weakened economy but a larger landmass, or that somehow Russia and China is a new axis of power and Russia will somehow just reorient their economy and there'll be a kind of new Cold War, but now with a different sort of setup. It's something else. It's something about, in this moment between worlds, where humanity as a whole really has to figure out a kind of renaissance. I think what I'm indicating is that the reason Ukraine matters is that that spirit of renaissance was and is still there. And if it's snuffed out, it's not clear where it's, you know, it will come elsewhere maybe, but something very important will have been lost. And we don't have much time to lose as well. The clock is ticking to save humanity from itself more generally. And so finding a resolution to this conflict, whether that's through vastly increasing pressure inside Russia for the Putin regime to fall, whether it's a no-fly zone over Ukraine to actually escalate militarily at great risk, don't get me wrong, it's not an easy decision at all, but it's worth asking what exactly is at stake with Ukraine. Is it just a piece of land that once belonged to the Soviet Union and therefore it's no biggie if it somehow goes back to a greater Russia? No, I think there's something more deeply philosophical and sort of ethical at stake here, which is that spirit of regeneration and renaissance was there latently in Ukraine and beginning to manifest. and it has to be allowed to do that again, because if it doesn't, what's next? You know, it could be China in Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, inspiring vis-a-vis digital democracy and much else besides. But it can also happen, you know, there are many other tyrants around the world. So yeah, that's why I think Ukraine matters. And over the next few weeks, I hope to discuss issues like, you know, everything from on what basis one takes risks in a context like this, when it comes to deciding military action. I want to speak about propaganda, and I also want to hear from Ukrainians themselves about how they see their current predicament and what they hope for their society, both prior to this context and now in this context. So there's a lot forthcoming, but I think it's my point of sharing this video is to try and convey why Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. It's really about a kind of microcosm and front line of a broader epochal battle for the spirit of humanity in a time between worlds. And I know that sounds grandiose as hell, but that's how I see it. Thanks very much.